All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute's book event, Law Schools Gone Lawless, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jeff Rosen. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and some of you may know me from past roles I've played in government. I've been a lawyer for more than 40 years, and I've previously taught at a law school. But those are only two of the many reasons why I'm enthused for today's discussion about a book that addresses law and law schools, and the chance to talk with the author of the book. This is a book that will get the attention of law schools, but a wider readership as well. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for today's book event, Ilya Shapiro, and talk with him about his book, Lawless. So first, a few words about Ilya Shapiro, our author. Ilya is currently the Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute, and, as we'll discuss later, for a brief time, he was previously the Executive Director at the Georgetown Law School Center for the Constitution. Ilya is a legal scholar, and during his career, he has filed more than 500 briefs in the Supreme Court, and he's written for several prominent publications, including, as examples, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Review, and others. He's also the author of a previous book called Supreme Disorder: Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. He is the co-author of Religious Liberties for Corporations, and he was an editor of 11 volumes of Cato's Supreme Court Review. He has spoken at law schools and at events with lawyers all over our country. His new book, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites, and you can see we have copies over here. His new book documents his experience at Georgetown Law in 2022 after a single tweet about President Biden's Supreme Court nominee led to calls for his immediate firing from Georgetown Law. He's going to tell us something about that, so I won't get into the details, but what happened to Ilya 3 years ago again highlighted the danger that campus orthodoxies can pose to freedom of speech and academic freedom in higher education. So Ilya has now written a book about not just that episode, but more broadly about the situation at top law schools and what's to be done. Now, in some ways, we've been warned about parts of this before. I might be the only one in this room old enough to remember this, but back in the 1990s, a couple of authors named David Sachs and Peter Thiel wrote a book about illiberalism at Stanford called The Diversity Myth: Multiculturalism and the Politics of Intolerance. That book warned that leading academic institutions were adopting anti-Western zealotry, silencing dissent, and stifling intellectual life. Other authors in that time frame sounded the alarm as well. And I would have to say, perhaps unsuccessfully, if one reads Ilya Shapiro's book about the events 30 years later, more recently. In his new book, Ilya Shapiro describes his thoughts on how the long rise of illiberalism and the unchecked decline of intellectual diversity and civil discourse in law schools has contributed to a climate of intolerance and lawlessness antithetical to the mission of legal education and the legal profession. As he'll discuss in a few moments, the book describes a sobering situation where a Stanford Law School mob can shut down a federal judge's speech at a Federalist Society event, where radical Columbia students can set up illegal encampments on their campus and threaten others, where heterodox faculty are not hired at some law schools, and where several federal judges even refused to hire Yale law students because of the law school's troubling record with regard to free expression and free thought. So Ilya's book provides an answer to a question on many people's minds, which is, where have law schools gone wrong? Quote, in the past, he writes, Columbia Law School produced leaders like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now it produces window-smashing activists, close quote. Ilya provides a timely perspective of what he sees occurring at some of America's elite law schools, what it means for the future of the legal profession, and what should be done. So it's my great honor to welcome Ilya Shapiro to the stage to talk about his book, and then he and I will discuss the book, and later after that, we'll invite all of you to ask questions. So Ilya, thank you very much for being here, and the podium is now yours.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. This isn't my first time speaking at AEI, but it's my first time speaking since they completely redid this building. Maybe it's my first time speaking in this building, actually. I remember the old one. And it's an organization whose events I've long attended and whose scholars I've enjoyed interacting with and working with. So thanks very much, Jeff, and Yuval Levin, who couldn't make it tonight, for hosting me. And indeed, it's auspicious that my first event in D.C. Comes on the third anniversary of the notorious tweet that was the seed for what eventually became this book, Lawless. Indeed, it was 3 years ago that news of Justice Breyer's retirement broke, and I was commenting all day in my area of expertise. My last book, as Jeff mentioned, Supreme Disorder, was about the politics of judicial nominations in the Supreme Court. So I was commenting in the media, and that night, coming back to my hotel room, not a best practice, by the way. Any lawyers, here's your CLE component. Do not doom scroll Twitter late at night when you're on the road, getting more and more upset, as in my case I was, about President Biden deciding to restrict his candidate pool for Breyer's successor by race and sex. I argued that the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, Sri Srinivasan, who happens to be an Indian-American immigrant, was the best choice, meaning by basic operation of logic, everyone else was less qualified. So if Biden kept his promise, he would pick what, given Twitter's character limit, I inartfully characterized as a lesser black woman. Now, I deleted that tweet, but still think that Biden should have considered all possible candidates, as 76% of the American people agreed, at least according to that right-wing rag ABC News. So anyway, that was three years ago. 3 years ago today. I don't want to recount it. In excruciating detail, you can read the book, The 4 Days of Hell, where it wasn't clear whether my entire professional life would be crumbling over this tweet that my ideological enemies misinterpreted willfully to go after my job. And then that followed with 4 months of following hell purgatory. A month later, a month into this investigation, since I wasn't fired nor vindicated initially, I was suspended pending investigation into whether I had violated university policies on harassment and anti-discrimination. A month later, I tried to speak at what's now called UC Law SF, formerly known as Hastings, UC Hastings. And the response I got there was a little different than this warm welcome that you all are giving me. The response the students gave was basically shut up, at least cleaned up for polite company. There was chanting and banging everywhere. It was like an Occupy Wall Street meeting. It was the first time I'd ever been disrupted in more than 1,000 public speaking events, and it's a damning indictment of the state of academia at a time when a toxic cloud has enveloped all of our public discourse. The Federal Society chapter had invited me to discuss my last book, which had become all the more timely with Breyer's retirement, and at that point, now Justice Jackson had just been nominated, but a heckler's veto prevailed, applying a bad faith lens to a poorly phrased tweet in which, as I said, I criticized President Biden. Maybe I was harassing him, Georgetown thought, I'm not sure. Activists called me a racist misogynist and my expertise illegitimate. So, suspended from the job that I was about to start at the Center for the Constitution, which we've now learned is an important center because the rest of the law school is the center against the Constitution, pending an investigation into whether I violated these university policies. And now the students who shut down my event at Hastings, or UC Law SF, by the way, where I'm returning next week. Very curious. Obviously, it's kind of like Dazed and Confused. I get older, they stay the same age. New cohort of students 3 years later, we'll see what happens. But anyway, the students did not want to hear my analysis or anything else. They acted in the vilest language imaginable, which I'm not going to repeat, several times, literally getting in my face and blocking my access to the lectern. The protesters also castigated their own school for allowing me to speak and called for diverse student representatives to approve speakers, plus, of course, mandatory training in critical race theory. Never mind that Hastings, as a public institution, would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on the content of their speech. And never mind that, as one of the deans advised them in the few minutes when the protesters weren't chanting and banging, I had briefly stepped out to confer with the officers of FedSoc who had invited me. I told them, you paid for an hour, I'm just going to stand there for an hour. But at that time, the dean told the students that not allowing an invited speaker to speak was against the rules. And as the school's chancellor pointed out in an email the next day, quote, disrupting an event to prevent a speaker from being heard is a violation of our code of student conduct, which the college will, indeed must, enforce. But it wasn't enforced, and nobody was disciplined. Now, you'd think that law students would have more appreciation for engaging with controversial topics than undergraduates. After all, they'll be facing much harder issues in their career than speakers they don't like. But my experience was no isolated incident, not even for that month of March of 2022. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale, ironically at an event bringing together speakers from the left and the right who agreed on nothing other than the importance of free speech. And then it happened, another disruption at Michigan, when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. And then a year later, as Jeff alluded to, was the shutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford. The only thing these events had in common was that they featured non-progressive speakers. We've gotten to a place where questioning affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the acceptable range of policy views. It's all well and good to adopt strong speech policies. All of these schools have them, Georgetown included, very good policy on paper or on pixels. But it's not enough if administrators aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting voices. Now, as for me, after a 4-month investigation, Georgetown reinstated me. Dean Bill Traynor cleared me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. They paid a lot of money to a DC white shoe law firm to have a junior associate look at the calendar and tell them that. But the Office of Institutional Equity, Diversity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA, set me up for discipline the next time I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. They said the next time I offended someone, I'd create a hostile educational environment, and I'd be back in the Star Chamber. Traynor reiterated these concerns, noting the harmful nature of my tweets. Now, after considering that report I got from IDEA and taking counsel from my lawyer, from Randy Barnett, who hired me, the law professor at Georgetown, and my wife, who's here in the front row, better lawyer than all of us, I concluded that remaining in my job was untenable. I couldn't do the job I was hired to do. So rather than participating in that slow motion firing, I quit. And as one does, I published my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal and announced my move to the Manhattan Institute on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox. I didn't ask for this, but I've been using the platform that I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia. Live not by lies, warned Solzhenitsyn. Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. And that's become my mantra. In fall of that year, 2022, when Justice Thomas withdrew from teaching at GW, it was just one more example of the poisonous atmosphere in academia that makes it impossible to have a free exchange of ideas. GW administrators rightly noted that he shouldn't be fired or canceled for his vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, but the fact that they needed to make that statement showed how they'd failed to instill a culture of open inquiry and truth-seeking. It's a shame that Thomas felt the need to withdraw, and a stark contrast to what was going on at Harvard, celebrating the return of Justice Breyer. Now, I'm generally optimistic about America. With Brett Kavanaugh, I live on the sunrise side of the mountain. And perhaps we're past peak woke in society generally. But we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher education. That's particularly dangerous in law schools, which train and produce the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. And I want to be clear, I do mean illiberal. What we're seeing is not the decades-old conservative complaint about liberal bias in the faculty, the hippies taking over the faculty lounge. I mean, those original hippies, the Berkeley free speech movement, would now be considered retrograde white supremacists by these radicals. And we have weak leaders who placate this illiberal left that now drives campus culture. University officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs. The DEI dean at Stanford egged on the mob that was shouting down Judge Duncan. And everyone else keeps their head down so as not to be caught in the cancellation crossfire. And that's largely a story of growing bureaucracies, right? We can talk about ideology all we want and faculty bias, but this kind of less sexy area is, I think, as much or more important. The statistics on the growth of these left-skewed non-teaching staff are mind-boggling. The number of university employees who don't teach has grown many multiples of growth of faculties or even students, while tuition has soared even more. Uniform statistics are hard to come by for the last 10 years or so. The survey agencies change their questions, they obfuscate certain things, but suffice it to say, it's a problem, and now all institutions have more non-teaching staff than faculty. Non-teaching staff who are not raised with academic values or virtues of academic freedom or open inquiry or what have you. The National Association of Higher Education Diversity Officers, for example, a real organization with thousands of members, their goal is not to create knowledge or advance open inquiry. It is something else, as I'll get to. These trends are particularly acute in so-called elite places. At Stanford, for example, the number of admins grew by 30% from 2017 to 2022, and the school has nearly twice as many non-teaching staff as undergrads, nearly 6 times as many as faculty. So the joke was 100 years ago, Yale students came with their own personal butlers. Well, now these educrats, as I call them, maybe they're going to be butlers for some of these students. In effect, students and families are paying a lot more to subsidize a well-paid class of bureaucrats. And administrators are more radical than professors. And of course, their incentive, as it is in the public sector, is to justify and enhance their own authority and budgets. So they manufacture outrage, investigate it, punish it, etc. This is, Mansur Olson, great political economist, said that the growth of bureaucracy leads to the decline of nations, and that is exactly the dynamic here, as these apparatchiks with no connection to teaching or research chill speech and eviscerate due process. Now, having gained a sense for the overall trends, let's look at DEI. Diversity officers are a fairly recent phenomenon that really started growing after the Michigan affirmative action cases at the Supreme Court in 2003. These diversicrats typically serve as special advisors to presidents and deans outside the normal hierarchy of university administration. A 2021 survey of 65 large universities representing 16% of all students at four-year institutions. The old Power 5 football conferences, now we have kind of 2 major football conferences and kind of others reshuffling. But anyway, the old Power 5, 65 schools, found that the average school had more than 45 people devoted to DEI, which is more than the number of history professors. At the University of Michigan, 261 people have authority, full-time authority over DEI, double that if you include part-time at a cost of more than $30 million a year. Imagine spending that on student support services or scholarships or what have you. This is the fastest growing segment of the educational bureaucracy, with staffs on average 4 times larger than those that provide mandated accommodations to students with disabilities. And let me be clear, in this survey, when we talk about DEI growth and bureaucratic bloat, this excludes those people who handle legally mandated requirements, enforcing Title IX or state and federal civil rights laws. You exclude those lawyers and support staff. This is just this other stuff. And they fail on their own terms. Campus climate surveys show that student satisfaction generally, comfort with diversity specifically, does not correlate or even maybe inversely correlates with the size and budgets of DEI offices. So the real danger is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry and pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they deploy this army of non-teaching educrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth-seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy. Having staff organize students' social lives, holding their hands while they process the trauma of election results they don't like, infantilizes the young adults who should be training for the workplace and public square. Having staff organize trainings, rallies, and struggle sessions to enforce narrow perspectives on race, sex, and class prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. It also shifts power away from faculty and gives it to political commissars whose goals diverge from long-held higher ed values. DEI offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, as well as therapeutic terms like harm and safety, not to promote equal opportunity or a welcoming environment, but to enforce progressive ideology. As I said, the behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob was illustrative of how these regimes are antithetical to universities' missions. And then there's the shift from education to indoctrination. When I was in law school in the early 2000s, we thought that the crits, critical legal studies, critical theory, all of that, this kind of Hegelian dialectic, culturally Marxist discourse, that was something from the 80s and early 90s. It was a spent force relegated back to its niche in sociology departments or area studies or what have you. Well, the crits are back, and not just in literature and sociology. Regardless of what's going on in K-12 or even undergrad teaching, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw have eclipsed Blackstone and Brandeis as avatars of legal education. That shift, when coupled with the bureaucratic growth, has led institutions to prioritize activism over inquiry, seeking social justice rather than truth. So I'm pessimistic that anything will change at any school where academic freedom isn't supported, where rules against hecklers' vetoes, takeovers of academic buildings, and encampments that block student access aren't enforced. Too few administrators followed the example of the late UChicago president, Bob Zimmer, who in response to pressure to punish Professor Dorian Abbott for criticizing affirmative action, reaffirmed the university's commitment to faculty freedom to disagree with university policy. Too few followed the lead of Vanderbilt Chancellor Daniel Diermeier, who ejected and expelled students who had taken over his office. He's gotten national plaudits for some very basic actions. It's a low bar. Wherever leaders stand up for the core mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. But most presidents and deans are spineless cowards. They're not woke radicals. They're careerists unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions. Mere statements about academic freedom and declining to fire Supreme Court justices are not enough. They have to instill a culture of respect for opposing views and enforce policies against disruption of educational programming. That means dismantling DEI bureaucracies that undermine classical liberal values and ending loyalty oaths in the form of diversity statements. Presidents and deans are really good at instilling whatever values they want, be that entrepreneurship, public service, social justice, whatever. They can do that for open inquiry and civil discourse. When I left Georgetown, I was not holding my breath about the prospect for reform. But maybe now we're finally seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. I'm still not sure it can all be done from within. So we need external controls from state legislators and attorneys general and congressional oversight tied to federal funding. We also need what economists call exogenous shocks, like Judge Ho's boycott of Yale and Stanford for clerk hiring, plus employers shying away from hiring those who support Hamas or who scream at federal judges that they hope their daughters are raped. And we need public exposure. In February of 2023, about 2 years ago, My now colleague at the Manhattan Institute, John Saylor, who's an investigative reporter, got some documents from FOIA and Freedom of Information Act and published one op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how Texas Tech, a public school, used diversity statements to hire biologists. The very next day, the president of the university said, we're not going to do that anymore. That's not appropriate. We've seen similar dynamics in other institutions. So that gives me some cautious hope because, to mix metaphors, some of these structures are Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. Claudine Gay, Harvard's former president, crystallizes the larger problem. She is a mediocre academic who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while checking the right intersectional boxes. She's the apotheosis of an anti-intellectual movement that values DEI, identity, and activism over truth-seeking, merit, and education. That movement is designed to prefer commissars over scholars. But Gay's resignation and the departure of presidents elsewhere doesn't end the university's troubles. For that matter, Dean Traynor at Georgetown recently announced that he would be leaving the deanship at the end of this semester. I don't know whether that was in anticipation of my book, but the timing was interesting. The school, Harvard or Georgetown Law, any of these schools that I talk about in my book, is still plagued by a toxic campus culture, ideological corruption, and bureaucratic bloat that stifle free discourse. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, recently named Harvard the worst school in the country for free speech for the second straight year. Well, Harvard may be the worst on this and other measures, but it's by no means alone. Look, it doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and centuries. The question now is whether higher education grandees are willing to do the work to restore their tarnished stature. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks for those observations and kind of a synopsis in a way of a whole book that hopefully people are going to read. But I wanted to start with how the book came about. Obviously, the episode that you've shared with us is an important part of it. So let me start there. When you started getting this reaction to your tweet and the suspension and investigation, what kind of reaction did you get from others in academia? Did you get people supporting you quietly, publicly, at all? Or how did that go?
There were two faculty members at Georgetown Law, basically the only two other non-progressives who dropped me nice lines. I got some notes from others in academia. I mean, I got a lot of support from outside of academia, and that was ultimately how I survived this, between FIRE and Barry Weiss and Camille Foster and the Wall Street Journal editorial board, National Review. So many people came out to defend me publicly, and then also behind the scenes, Board of Visitors, people back-channeling to the dean and things like that. But yeah, academia, not so much, other than people who are already my friends.
So one of the things in the book that I thought was interesting about the episode was you said you conferred with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, as it used to be. I forget what it now.
An expression.
An expression.
It's
okay.
unfortunate that they've had to broaden their remit.
So, and if I got this right, in the book you say they advised you not to apologize for the way you had phrased the tweet. I'm interested both how that discussion went and what you decided to do and why.
So this was kind of the deleted chapter from my book, which ended up becoming an article in City Journal magazine, which I commend to you. It's a Manhattan Institute publication. I've been reading it for more than 20 years, long before I joined MI. And I talked about, I forget what it's called, but it's like how to survive cancel culture, or should I apologize, or something like this. And it all depends on your goal. I would have acted differently during this episode if I had decided that I'm just going to milk the moment, I'm going to monetize it, I'm going to become a right-wing darling or something like that, a martyr. things like that. I would have acted differently if I just wanted to lead a quiet life and kind of become a drilled down academic and abnegate myself and things like that. But I didn't want either of those two things, or certain other things, going for another job somewhere else. I wanted that job. I wanted to survive and get that job and do the job that I've been hired for, which presented an opportunity to have a different kind of impact on the world, which is what I'm all about. And I was advised by people other than FIRE that because I'm not apologizing to the Twitter mob, that's pointless, and that is counterproductive. I fully agree with FIRE on things like that. But my audience was one person, Dean Traynor. And I was advised that he wanted an apology. So I said, well, what am I apologizing for? I misworded things. Okay, it was a poorly worded tweet. To this day, I admit that, I say that. Who among us hasn't issued a poorly worded tweet? And so I said that. I was invited by other deans and professors at Georgetown on the faculty listserv and otherwise to apologize further using critical race theory tropes and do the work this and all, and I declined to do that. I'm like, I'm not into that. I failed in communication, which is my bad, but I maintain that whether you're hiring a judge or a janitor, you shouldn't be considering race and sex and things like that.
So in the early part of the book where you are discussing the episode, you talk about at Georgetown, I think it's the dean, maybe it was someone other than the dean, expressed concern because there had been students who were walking out of class in tears, and I think the dean was interested in providing some sort of a crying room. And at what level?
At a law school, at a so-called elite law school. Also, there was a demand for reparations in the form of lunch. I mean,
so that part, what you just said, comes through in the book. So now what I want to ask you is, if you put yourself in the position of the administrators, the dean or other administrators, if students are behaving that way, whether you think it's appropriate or inappropriate, how do you think the administrators should react and respond?
If Dean Traynor had said on day one, this was bad communication, and I don't agree with Ilya, but our speech and expression policy is clear, and we do not police faculty speech, period. There would have been something, but it would have dispersed quickly, at least based on when that path is taken elsewhere. That's generally what's happened.
So how did you decide after going through this that you would take the time, energy, commitment it takes to do a book?
Man plans and God laughs. My last book I wrote with 2 preschoolers in the house, and it was hard. It was hard on the family. Writing a book is a commitment. Rule 1, if any of you want to write a book at some point, if you haven't yet, rule 1 is apply butt to chair. You have to do that every day without fail for a period of months until, almost all of it's done. And so this time we had our little cancellation babies. That's another part of the whole personal story. While the investigation was ongoing, we learned that Kristen was pregnant with twins. So I really didn't want to write a book at that point with not just the 2 elementary schoolers at this point, but the infants as well. But my agent got me a good deal with a publisher that approached me about doing it, and I thought, well, they made me an offer I can't refuse. I got to do it. I certainly have things to get off my chest. It's an important topic. Let's do it. And I tried to get it done as quickly as possible to rip off the Band-Aid. So here we are.
So one of the things I'm always interested when you do a book is who do you see as the intended audience or audiences? Because on the one hand, you could picture this being a book to try to persuade law school deans and administrators, or this could be a book to rally those who are concerned about the more problematic episodes that are described. Or you could have multiple. I'm just interested, how did you think about that? Who would you say is the intended audience for the book?
Well, it's a popular book, meaning it wasn't with an academic press. That wasn't my goal. It's with HarperCollins, their broadside imprint. Anyone interested in public affairs. Certainly law school audiences, both academics and students, as well as the legal profession, but people more broadly. And after October 7th, when the crisis in higher education really came to the fore, became a central part of the national discourse, I thought, okay, this will get even more purchase because, as I said, a lot of what I talk about, what you heard me just mention in my prepared remarks, is common to higher ed in general. There are certain things and certain worrying things about law schools, and that's where my focus lay. But this, as Bill Ackman wrote in a very important essay that came out the same day that Claudine Gay resigned the Harvard presidency, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine that pops up wherever there are serious underlying problems and pathologies. And I think that's what we've seen come out in higher ed. So I think anyone who cares about the future of our educational system should be the audience.
So let me ask you just a couple of quick things on the title. Lawless. What would you say is the core of what is lawless in the book, that you're focused on?
The departure of law schools from teaching the law. I open fairly early on with a vignette from the Paper Chase, which is a storied movie from now over 50 years ago, very kind of musty old school professor using the Socratic method, asking questions to get to the point he's making about the law, and how everyone took the same course, 1L year, and he just got drilled in. This is how you start thinking like a lawyer and all of this. And it's very different now. And a lot of students and a lot of faculty question the legitimacy of the law itself. Which I think is dangerous because when you're undermining the very foundations on which the Republic stands, well, it's very dangerous. I'll just leave it at that.
So maybe this is a related question, but the miseducation of America's elites is the subtitle. So can you sort of point to what are the aspects that are miseducation? Because presumably law schools are still teaching contracts and torts and constitutional law, for example.
Somewhat. I mean, depends. Some of these classes, not just constitutional law or civil rights or some of the more politically contentious things, but they're criminal law classes where they don't teach half the curriculum because it's triggering or what have you. How are you supposed to be a prosecutor or a criminal defense lawyer if that's what you're doing, or if you can't entertain certain types of arguments? How do you zealously represent your client, whether it be in court or in negotiations, if half the other side's argument is something that you don't even allow your mind to entertain? There's a lot of from the faculty and also from the kind of culture created by the bureaucracies. That's a miseducation.
So I referenced in the introduction of the book from 30 years ago. There have been a number of books over the years that I'm sure you're familiar with. The Alan Bloom Closing of the American Mind back in 1987, and Charles Allen Core's The Shadow University, The Betrayal of Liberty on Campuses and the like. I haven't read them all, so I don't purport to know them all, but it seemed to me those were about universities, and your book is very focused to law schools. Is there, with regard to law schools, would you say they're a subset of the same issue that the universities are dealing with, or is it something different?
Well, there's a great deal of overlap, of course, because they share administrations, they are governed together. The dean is part of the cabinet, if you will, of the president, and they work with the provost and things like that. They don't exist in a vacuum, but there are problems unique to law schools. If you're teaching the rule of law, and the attitude is free speech is part of white supremacy, or that people should be sentenced. Equality under the law is a sham, and people should be sentenced based on their race for equivalent conduct. That's a real problem in law schools, more than if you're teaching the exact same thing to anthropology or sociology students, because after all, again, lawyers implement this stuff. They are the disproportionately represented among state and federal legislators. They occupy so many important positions in executive branch authorities, let alone the obvious prosecutors' offices and general counsel's offices of Fortune 500 companies.
So in your remarks, and I think this is in the book as well, you make the point, I forget how you put it, that the critical scholars had been put back in sociology or literature, but less ascendant in the law schools at one point. And one of the thoughts I had as you were saying that was, well, of course, people who study sociology or literature often become important public figures in their own ways. Sometimes they go to law school and become. So is there something about law schools that calls for special attention?
Well, just like medical schools, and what's going on there is literally a matter of life and death, and the subversion of merit there is scary, just like it is for air traffic controllers and pilots and things like that, for obvious reasons. I think in law schools, the occasional sociologist who becomes a big public intellectual aside, it's more dangerous to subvert and have an illiberal takeover of law schools than of these more academic departments. Now, clearly, it's a sad thing, and it's bad for the development of human knowledge to have other things happen in academia. But it's really has more direct practical consequences when it comes to law schools.
So, in thinking about the problem that your book is addressing, you put a focus on the growth of bureaucracy and the DEI bureaucracy in part, but bureaucracy generally, as I read it. Mm-hmm. And I think what I've heard some administrators say is the university has been asked to do more, campus security being an example, or summer job placements or internships, and that the roles of the university have grown that. How do you view that?
Well, it's true that it used to be the case that you had many fewer deans and associate deans and vice deans and what have you in law schools, and in undergrad, the same person would be the study abroad advisor and the internship advisor and something else, things like that. But why have those grown so much faster than either faculty or students? Especially in the digital age where students can find and research internships themselves and all these things, it's certainly not legally mandated. And I don't, there is some, the early stages of the bureaucratic growth in the late 90s, early 2000s, when schools started competing against each other for amenities, the lazy rivers and the climbing walls and all of these sorts of, fancier cafeterias and things like that. Those are non-teaching staff, of course, but it's these other kind of administrators that have a role in acculturating students and orienting them in teaching them outside of class, where most of the growth has been in the last 10, 12 years. That's worrying even beyond the financial consequences.
So another thing I sometimes have heard people observe is it's not really the numbers of the bureaucracy, and it's not about DEI per se, because inclusion is, I think, widely supported. It's more creating a home for certain political activists. Do you see it that way, or do you see it differently?
Sure. There's two things to say on that. One is the role of admissions offices, and now we've talked a lot about deans and presidents, and we've talked a lot about DEI offices, but the admissions office plays a role here, especially in elite places, your Yale, Stanfords, Columbias. They put a thumb on the scale for people who write in their personal statement, I want to blow things up and change the world and burn down these institutions and remake them in this view. That's going to get you more points than if you say you want to prosecute child molesters or you want to make markets more efficient for consumers or something like that. And so admissions deans are complicit in the transformation into activism rather than education. The other thing is mismatch Stuart Taylor there is in the back, wrote an amazing book detailing how when you apply identity preferences and you end up with people of members of racial minorities clustering in lower quartiles, then people observe, oh, the school must be systemically racist. Why are the racial minorities underperforming much more than everyone else? So that creates an activist cycle in and of itself, as well as leading to failures where if you calibrate, again, the admissions right, which hopefully some schools are doing in response to the Supreme Court opinion, although like the desegregation orders in the 50s and 60s, there's massive resistance, which will have to be counteracted governmentally. But we're at the start of the pushback on all of these illiberal things.
So what about, one of the things you were talking about that again is in the book is, from your point of view, it was less about the ideological outlook of the faculty and more these activists in the administration, let's say. But in the book, I thought this was interesting. At page 170, you had a quantification that at Georgetown, I'm just looking at my notes here, 3 of 150 faculty would be considered right of center.
And most of the rest of the faculty think that's 3.5 too many.
So why do you think that's not an issue?
Oh, it is, but that's kind of an age-old issue. That's not as different as it was 10, 20 years ago. And the continuation of that is why I'm more pessimistic about academia than about society writ large, because there could be this doom spiral. And when there's such blatant ideological or viewpoint discrimination in hiring, it kind of self-replicates. As well as, and this is somewhat new, the old boomer liberals, if you will, are different than the younger millennial progressives. There was a Wall Street Journal op-ed a few years ago by a classical liberal history or psychology professor or something who said that he was, he was about to retire, but he said he was afraid of his students and his younger faculty. And this is someone who's, a card-carrying ACLU member, would have been one of those Berkeley free speech types and all that. So there is some dynamic, but at the end of the day, there's just not a critical mass. And there's people who have blind spots, who think that, in the famous formulation that conservatism is a mental tic or a disorder or something like that. You can't be a good, English analyst if you're also conservative and things like that.
So thinking about the situation of law schools, everyone who arrives there has already been through college. So to what extent?
So there's been a lot of miseducation already.
Well, that was going to be the question: is what effect do you think that has on the illiberalism that you're concerned about?
And K to 12. I mean, look, these problems don't arise in a vacuum. Absolutely. I mean, is it harder for law schools to take these incoming students? Are they less prepared than they were when I was in law school? You probably think that my generation is less prepared than when you were in law school because certain things have gotten softer. I'm sure there's something to that, but that doesn't excuse the law schools from, not being able to churn out lawyers, especially again at these elite places that don't know how to write a proper memo, that are too stressed to face a deadline. I mean, you hear these just bizarre stories quite apart from any ideological things.
So let's take that as the platform to talk a little bit what your book discusses in terms of what might be done about some of these things. And I guess one place to start is, to what extent are students, in your view, part of the problem, part of the solution, both? How do you see that?
Well, student mobs are a problem, certainly. There's, collective action problems. There's, most students, even at what you could consider to be the worst places or the places with the worst campus cultures, are not radicals. They're not going in with, shouting at federal judges and things like that. Most of them are, silent majority that just they just want to go get their credential, find a good job, have some fun along the way, and that's about it. And because of the failure in leadership that placates the rabble-rousers, that makes it worse for everyone else.
So early in the book, you talk about that incident at Stanford with the federal judge, and that although the dean took some forward-looking measures about the school's policies, there was really no consequences to the students who had disrupted the event. Do you have views on whether more suspensions, expulsions, or other forms of student discipline are desirable, undesirable?
And she then fell up. Jenny Martinez is now the provost at Stanford, because again, it's a very low bar, and relative to that, she did some good things. Her memo, it was a 10-page memo about the disruption and about Stanford's policies, is worth reading. Although she does get a couple of things wrong. One is the lack of discipline, because she claims that not everybody can be identified and therefore nobody can be disciplined. Well, if that was the excuse, then nobody would ever be arrested or sent to jail for committing crimes and things like that. The other thing is that she says that shutting down speakers is against the values of DEI. And I'm not sure about that, because I think Stanford's DEI dean was well trained in her profession. Evoked her whole line, if you can recall this episode, was, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is what you have to say, Judge Duncan. The event was going to be about how lower courts judge given uncertainty from the Supreme Court about COVID and guns and something else. It wasn't anything that the students were directly protesting, but his mere presence there, because he had worked, filed briefs against same-sex marriage and wrote some things about abortion, and as a judge had a so-called controversial opinion about pronoun usage of prisoners and things like this. He was denying people's humanity. He was, creating harm. His mere presence was harm. So was the juice that he was going to give worth the squeeze? That is textbook DEI enforcement. Your rights, your freedoms, the value of what you have to say depends on where you are in the privilege hierarchy. I mean, all of these things. So perhaps there is some utopian, platonic DEI that congeals well with free speech, like then Dean Martinez said, but haven't seen it in practice.
So a related question on the discipline type point. I think of it as boycotting the boycotters. In the book, you talk about some judges who are then refusing to recruit at certain law schools, and that's got some attention. So how do you see that?
I'm in favor of it for reasons that Judge Jim Ho of the Fifth Circuit, along with Lisa Branch of the 11th Circuit, are sort of the ringleaders of this. He has, Jim Ho, I'm a little biased towards this, he's been a longtime friend, and he defended me as well. When he came to spoke at Georgetown, he kind of ripped up his notes and started defending me and then published that. And in that public defense, he also announced his boycott and talks about how, look, this is trying to pressure the school. This is forward-looking, so it's not anyone who was at the school when he announced the boycott was not affected. Same thing with Yale, same thing eventually when it was expanded to Columbia for its inability to control anti-Semitism. I think that's right. And at the margins, students need to be aware of the policies of their schools. Just like, imagine in the 50s, you just want to get a good education. You hear that UT Austin is a good place to go to law school, but they don't admit blacks. You have no problem with black students, but they don't. You just want to go about, can a judge say, I'm not going to hire from there because of their discriminatory policies? It's the same kind of trying to pressure. I think it's a valid way to go. And I've been told that at Yale, part of the reason why Dean Gerken, who has been, I think, rightly criticized, including by me in my book, for various scandals that Yale has had, alumni at Yale say that this is good, and this is one of the, even though there's only 14 judges involved, it's been noticed, and it's one of the pressure points that as Dean Gerken wants to become President Gerken somewhere someday, that she's tried to fix.
So just a little bit of devil's advocacy here. How do you think conservatives would react if some liberal judges said, we're not going to recruit anyone who's at a law school and joined the Federalist Society, or we're not going to recruit from a law school that's perceived as at least more balanced than some.
They're welcome to do that if they want to make that point. A lot of judges don't hire Federalist Society members, and it's kind of well known. They don't feel a need to announce it per se. You can look at their hiring patterns and whatnot. A lot of judges do have ideological criteria, and rightly so. You don't want to be aggravated the whole year or work with someone necessarily. Some judges like to have counter clerks or what have you, but others don't. It's depending on how you want to work. As long as it's, transparency is important. So I'm glad that if these judges were going to do that with Yale and Stanford and Columbia, that they announced it and made it a public thing rather than just kind of doing it sub rosa, as I imagine some other judges already are.
So on this same general topic of, what can be done or what should be done, one of the interesting things I saw in your book was about admissions. That I don't know that I'd seen this one before, but you advocated, if I got this right, correct me if I don't, because it's your book, that admissions focus on...
Thank you for doing the close reading, by the way. This is impressive.
So
I give you an A on the book report.
So, well, maybe I should apply to law school. But what you suggest is admissions offices screening and valuing people who indicate in their essays or otherwise an interest in being, practicing. I don't mean this pejoratively, but workaday lawyers, people that want to work on cases or work on transactions or do, the daily job of lawyering, rather
what
than
most lawyers do, not what I do.
But rather than give extra credit, let's say, in applications to people who want to be social justice activists or other kinds of political actors. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that?
It's just these are the patterns that we're seeing. It takes all kinds. If you want to, create a well-balanced class, you don't want to just accept people who want to do antitrust law or all people who want to do criminal law or something like that. But if that activism trumps merit, then it's a problem. And again, I think it's more of a problem the higher up in the rankings you go, with some exception.
And so one other thing on the what is to be done. In the book, you talk about what you call the Chicago trifecta of the University of Chicago Calvin principles of institutional neutrality, of free expression, and merit in hiring, if I can oversimplify those. Do you have thoughts on what it would take or how it would be that law schools and universities generally, I guess, but law schools in particular, would get there to adopt the Chicago trifecta that you advocate?
Well, a number of them have adopted the free speech principles. Like I said, Georgetown's policy, or Stanford's policy for that matter, are pretty good on paper. A lot of them are now, belatedly, since October 7th, adopting institutional neutrality. Better late than never. Come on in, the water's fine. Not too many say that they discriminate based on ideology in hiring, but it's a truism that places like Chicago or George Mason Scalia Law School can play Moneyball and hire people that would otherwise be in higher ranked, so-called more prestigious schools if there wasn't ideological discrimination. There should be savvy entrepreneurial deans who play Moneyball, who say, look, the bar is very low. If I just make everyone with all views feel welcome and encourage civil discourse and bring back rigor and graduate students that judges will be pleased with and employers will be pleased with, that is going to burnish the reputation of our law school. And I can get alumni on board with that. Maybe that'll help me raise money, because ultimately that's what deans want. It's, will this raise me money? And I think there's a way to pitch it.
So we're going to shift in just a couple of minutes to audience questions. Before we do that, one that I might anticipate, so I'll ask it, is we're here at AEI, and often there are young people who are interested in advice. So would you have any advice for young conservatives who are thinking about law school, how they should think about the question of going to, let's say, a top-ranked school that perhaps is subject to some of the criticisms in your book versus a school that's also a good law school but isn't maybe in the top 14, but is more open to diverse viewpoints and to more conventional respect for free speech. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, conservative or otherwise, I would advise young people not to go to law school. I think a lot of people go as a default or because they see it as prestigious or, well, I have this history degree, well, what can I do with that? I don't know, law school seems kind of interesting. There's a lot of lawyers who are, powerful or prestigious or something. I'll just go do that. And that's not a good reason. I liken applying to law school as kind of converting to Judaism. You kind of approach several times, and if you're still committed, then let's talk about it. Do you have the right reasons? What kind of lawyer do you want to be? What is your plan? Are you thoughtful about this? And then there's the money issue. I wouldn't go 200 now, 300 grand into debt to go anywhere. There are market signals. If you can't get money from a place that you want to go to, then you probably ought not go there. And then there are other considerations like what exactly do you want to do? Just like I got at least a master's, maybe even a doctorate in crisis management through my experience here, the troubles, as some of my friends call it. And one of the things I learned is goal setting is so important. Again, your strategy depends on what goal you set. So, do you want to work at a big firm in New York? No, you really don't want to do that. Do you want to be involved in a presidential administration in Washington? Do you want to practice international law in Latin America, be based in Miami? Do you want to go back to your mid-sized city hometown and kind of work there, maybe eventually get into politics or just become kind of a civic leader there? Do you want to become a prosecutor? The answers to these questions, do you want to be a professor? All of those questions, plus the money, will affect your decision-making matrix just as much as, well, what is FIRE's latest free speech rankings and things like that. But I can tell you of the so-called, elite prestigious schools, it's slim pickings where I would say things are good. Chicago, which I might be biased because I went there, is really dedicated to this stuff. They've kind of gone away from faculty ideological diversity of late, in part because some other schools have picked up people. But that's a good place. UVA has had a mixed record. The university as a whole has had a pretty not very good, but the law school's been decent. I don't know. At the end of the day, these rankings are artificial as well. I don't know who's ranked 13th versus 17th. Why does it matter? Or 20th versus 30th. If you want to practice in Georgia, go to an Atlanta school rather than University of Iowa or Alabama that's ranked higher than University of Georgia or something like that.
So the one other thing I'm going to say before we invite on questions is the book was released, I think it was on January 14th, and understand you're doing some other speaking events for that, so people who want to hear more can access podcasts and perhaps some other speaking.
Absolutely. If you look at my Substack, I call Shapiro's Gavel. I wrote up the first month and a half of my schedule in one of my last posts, so you can kind of follow me around there. But yeah, there's, I think, already videos and certainly audio podcasts around, and I'm happy to chat. Drop me a line you can follow me on Twitter at @iShapiro. You can figure out my email. That's a test for would-be lawyers. If you can't figure out my email, then I don't know.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your comments and observations and for sharing your thoughts about the book. Let's now open it up to audience questions. Why don't we start right here in front?
Well, thank you for coming. Sorry. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for speaking. I was just wondering, does accreditation have a place in this at all? And if so,
I swear
how?
I didn't plant this question. This is the least sexy part of this whole thing, and it's dry and it's boring, but there's only one accreditor of law schools in the entire country, and that's the American Bar Association. I have a whole chapter about the ABA and how it's gone downhill. I mean, can you imagine Just over 50 years ago, Lewis Powell parlayed his presidency of the ABA into joining the Supreme Court. Now, I mean, if you're a lawyer, Jeff, do you know who the president of the ABA is? I don't. It's just not. It's not an important position. It's just one more left-wing activist group, one more pressure group. I think 17% of lawyers are members, something like that. It's a problem. So one very easy thing, a lot of bang for the buck, would be for this new education department to simply remove the accreditation monopoly.
Why don't we come over here?
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I was wondering what you think of the LSAT, and do you feel like it's a good method for students to get into law school?
The LSAT, like the SAT for undergrad, is a leveling test. It allows you to measure, well, what does that inflated 4.2 GPA at Princeton mean compared to some kid who's like #1 in his class at University of Oklahoma, but they don't give bonuses, they don't give A pluses or whatever the case might be. How do you evaluate? How do you compare their education? Moreover, in law school, it might be even more useful, the LSAT versus the SAT for undergrad, because it tests logical reasoning skills, which you can learn, by the way, that game section, which might have gone away now. I don't know, they keep fiddling with it. But reading comprehension, vocabulary, logic, these are very important to law schools, and there's a great correlation in terms of the grades that you get in law school with LSAT scores. So yeah, after a brief pause during the pandemic, I think almost all law schools have gone back to it, and that's a good thing.
Come over here.
Thanks. There's been a lot of talk lately, just thinking a bit more broadly than necessarily law schools, but there's been a lot of talk lately, especially since the inauguration, that, the tide has turned on a lot of this stuff, on DEI, on so-called woke culture. I'm wondering, do you think that's actually true, and to what extent? For example, if someone made that tweet from 3 years ago today, do you think they would be subject to the same response?
Well, there's multiple things going on here. There's kind of what's going on in society more broadly, where clearly there's been what gets called a lot now a vibe shift, as instantiated in the election, as kind of a pushback to some weirdness and craziness, whether in corporate America or elsewhere. Then there's the legal side, and these executive orders are amazing and surprising in kind of the neutral senses of those terms. I mean, it's more than I thought would happen. Certainly much better lawyered than the early days of the Trump administration 8 years ago. If anyone predicted that not only would Trump rescind Biden's DEI executive orders, but Lyndon Johnson's affirmative action executive order, I mean, go take that to the stock market, that prognostication skill. But mere orders is not enough. You see lots of institutions merely renaming their offices or moving people around or not really changing things. You see, especially in higher ed, there's massive resistance to these kinds of changes, and it'll take enforcement by the Education Department, by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, by state attorneys general. In Texas and Florida were one of the early adopters of just abolishing DEI bureaucracies. Again, nothing to do with what professors say in class or what courses they teach, but just these non-teaching things. And yet a lot of schools have just kind of played this shuffling game. So it's, the price of liberty, or sanity in this case, is eternal vigilance. Or to quote Churchill, this isn't the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It might be the end of the beginning.
So I'll come here in a second, but we have one online question that I wanted to share. Somebody has asked, with regard to the federal judges who are boycotting students from certain law schools, are other students from those law schools urging their administrators to make changes so their reputation of their school or their success as students at those schools isn't tainted by their peers and their own opportunities limited?
I've heard about alumni making such comments to their deans, especially young alumni who obviously have the most to gain or lose from the reputation of their diploma. Because of course, as you go on in your career, where you went matters less and less. I don't know about current students exactly. If the boycott works in making students cognizant of these things, and the students that at the margins are affected and they decide not to go to those schools, then presumably that means there will be less feedback from current students. But I don't know specifically.
Right here.
There's been a lot of conversations about how the right has responded to all of this on the Title VI front with regard to anti-Semitism in particular. And I think many free speech absolutists on the right have reevaluated that position as a result of the sort of what we can call maybe a culture of violence that has animated these campuses that's been sort of stoked by faculty, et cetera. And I wonder, where do you think the line should be drawn, and do we pose a risk in slipping down kind of a similar Title IX, woke rabbit hole in the Title VI direction in the coming future?
I also did not plant that question, but it's an important one. I'm not for merely adding anti-Semitism to the list of protected categories, restructuring the intersectional matrix to protect Jews better and things like that. No, it's to quote a line from a movie from 40 years ago, War Games. The only way to win is to not play. So you don't get into these victimhood Olympics and what have you. And as to the speech versus other stuff, speech isn't violence. I wrote an essay for the Free Press in November of 2023 that was supposed to be originally, they commissioned an op-ed, it ballooned into this 2,500 word piece, which I think still holds up, about kind of different buckets. First of all, speech, things that aren't speech. Even if it's expressive but isn't speech. There's one example, somebody urinated on a Hillel, Jewish student organization building, and claimed the defense that, well, they're just being expressive. Sorry, no. If you beat somebody up because you don't like their political views, I don't care that you're politically motivated. That might even enhance your sentence because of these hate crime rules and things like that. So not speech. Then there is not protected speech, right? True death threats, or child pornography, which we're not talking about in this circumstance, or intimidation or harassment. It's one thing to kind of in the middle of a public park, public square, say things. It's quite another to like march down to, again, the Hillel or a Jewish student dorm and start shouting things and things like that, or direct incitement of violence and what that is. And there's a lot of Supreme Court jurisprudence over that. And then there's time, place, and manner restrictions. So just like for expressive value, you can't just block a highway or a street to make your point. Well, you can, because there's lack of will by political leaders in blue states and cities, but the law says you can't, that's not protected. Similarly, I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump and Joe Biden or something like that, right? Time, place, and manner. On campus, that means you can't disrupt classes, student organization events, blocking access to buildings, all of these kinds of rules that say that there are limits. It's not an absolutist. Even the most absolutist recognizes that there's limits in certain circumstances. So we have to fine-tune those kinds of understandings, and so it's not a matter of punishing people who have the wrong views, whether those wrong views be anti-Semitism, racism, anti-Catholic bigotry, what have you. It's what you do with those views. Are you harassing, intimidating? And there's a big debate about what the harassment standard should be. So for those of you who are interested in the legal details, the Davis standard is very good and should be pursued. But anyway, it's a nuanced question.
Looks like we have time for one more, so let's take this gentleman in the back.
Hello, have I got this right? For those who would like to see healthy change of the things you're talking about, there's a school of thought, I think, that the legacy institutions, the Harvards, the Yales, the Stanfords, are too far gone to be saved. And I think Neil Ferguson has said things like that, although he said them a while ago, maybe before the Hamas demonstrations changed some people's thinking. The question is whether reforming the old institutions is worth the effort, or whether creating new institutions, the University of Austin's a paradigm, would be a better way to go.
The answer is yes. I'm for all of the above. We never know what's going to be successful in what way. I just spoke at the University of Austin Friday night. Just amazing institution. They just admitted their first class, so it's all freshmen right now. This and next year at least, it's going to be free tuition for those who go there. Very entrepreneurial. They have this thing called the Austin Union, kind of like the Oxford Union or the Yale Political Union. These sorts of things. Debate society. Very very well organized, and so all luck to them. Similarly, there's been centers and institutes in existing schools: Arizona State, UNC, Florida State, University of Florida, other places. Ironically, these to instill critical thinking and civics education and rigor, the sorts of things that the rest of the institution has failed in. So that's good too. Hard to do those sorts of things with law schools because, again, the accreditation cartel. But University of Austin is thinking about starting a law school eventually. So again, I'm for all of the above. In that context, let 100 flowers bloom.
All right, well, with that, let us thank our guest, Ilya Shapiro, author of Lawless. We appreciate your being here.